Thanks everyone for joining us again. This is our last Women on Wednesdays of the session, of the Louisiana legislative session. Women on Wednesdays is a bi-weekly advocacy campaign to advance policies for women in Louisiana. Each week we host groups of advocates to learn about the key issues that are affecting women across our state and the impacts of proposed legislation. Our goal is to give you the information and tools that you need to influence the legislative process and to hear directly from advocates that are working on these issues and, when we can, state lawmakers. We have invited a couple of lawmakers to join us this evening. However, they are all still in session. It's the last 2 days, so I think that we need to be prepared for them not to be able to hop on, but they have been invited, so hopefully we'll see them poke their heads in, and we can give them some space to talk about some of the bills that they've been working on. Just some housekeeping things. We are recording this and we will share the link with you and post it to our YouTube channel. You can find links to past Women on Wednesday recordings there too. And if you have questions, please type them in the chat or use the raise hand feature. And Ms. Robin, my colleague, will ask our guests those questions when we get to that section. So we ask everyone to stay on mute if you're not presenting until we get to the Q&A. So we're really excited for our last Women on Wednesday to be focused on preventing violence against women. And we have two great organizations that are working on these issues. We have the Sexual Trauma Awareness and Response, or STAR, as most people know the organization, whose mission is to support survivors of sexual trauma, improve systems response, and to create social change to end sexual violence. Any of you who have been following legislation dealing with this issue, with sexual assault and with domestic violence over the past few years, knows that there actually has been a lot of amazing work that's been done at the legislature. And, you know, a lot of the credit has to go to STAR. So we're really excited to have Rachel Hebert and Morgan Lamondre from STAR with us this evening. We also have Moms Demand Action, which is a grassroots movement of Americans fighting for public safety measures that can protect people from gun violence. So we know that so much of the issue around domestic violence, homicides, is closely linked to the accessibility of guns in our community. And there's been some really great legislation and some partnership that's happened this session on that issue. So we wanted to bring both of these groups together to have a conversation about this. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time going into details about this, because with Louisiana, although we care a lot about this issue and we follow it very closely, we're not the experts, which is why we've invited these folks on this evening, because they absolutely are the experts. So I am going to go ahead and turn it over, and I will see if Red is ready.
Yep.
All right. So Red, you are a co-host. If you have a presentation, you can share your screen, and if not, then I'm just going to stop the share and give you the floor.
Okay, yeah, I do have a presentation, so I'll go ahead and share. If you can just confirm for me that you can see my screen.
We can see your screen.
Okay. So yes, thank you for having me and Moms Demand Action here, our Louisiana chapter on Women on Wednesdays. And we are, it has been a tough legislative session when it comes to the issues that we care about, and particularly around firearms, and I'll go into some of those details, but I did want to talk a little bit about just an overview of gun violence in Louisiana, guns and domestic violence, women and gun violence in Louisiana, and then what is some of the current laws that we have in place that have been put in place over the last several years, what are our current concerns, and then legislative updates. Before I get into that, I can introduce myself. I'm Red Devitt. I am the local group leader for the New Orleans area group of Moms Demand Action as part of the Louisiana chapter. I've been working with moms for a little close to 4 years at this point. And when it comes to legislative, of course, we work across the entire state. Specifically, when it comes to firearm bills, we have something called preemption in Louisiana. So localities cannot pass laws that are more strict than the state level. We also know that we haven't seen a lot of action at a federal level. So really a lot of what is happening that's impacting gun violence and domestic homicides in our state is happening in our state legislature. So just kind of a little bit of an overview. In an average year, 990 people die, and 4,397 are wounded by guns in Louisiana. So that puts Louisiana as having the highest rate of gun violence in the United States and the 4th highest rate of gun deaths in the United States. And that's all types of gun violence. You can see how that breaks down on the right-hand side of the screen. Louisiana, 46% of our gun deaths are suicide. That's compared to 60% nationwide. So we actually have a lower percentage that are suicides. 52% are homicides compared to 38% nationally. So we have a much higher percent of homicides in the state of Louisiana. When it comes to guns and domestic violence, we know that there's such an overlap and such a connection there. Women in the US are 21 times more likely to be killed with a gun than women in other high-income countries. Every month, on average, 57 women are shot and killed by an intimate partner, and many more are shot and wounded. 1 million women alive today have been shot or shot at by an intimate partner in this country. And there is also a connection to mass shootings that we see, especially these high-profile mass shootings, but 53% of mass shootings, the perpetrator shot an intimate partner or family member, and as part of their incident of mass shooting. Also, access to guns. I'll talk about that a little bit when I talk about some of the legislation and some of the proponents of some of the legislation that's out there that we disagree with. But access to a gun makes it 5 times more likely that the abusive partner will kill his female victim. So having more guns will not make us safer, particularly as women, and particularly when it comes to domestic violence, homicide. And while deadly intersections of gun violence and intimate partner violence affects all women, we do want to know that disproportionately impacts Black, American Indian, Alaskan, Native, and Hispanic women. And we also know that segments of the LGBTQ community and people with disabilities are also very vulnerable to these forms of relationship abuse, and of course, the intersection with guns there. There isn't a lot of data on the intersection of firearms and intimate partner violence among these populations because of underreporting, and also because on a national level, there has been actively working against collecting data when it comes to gun violence in this country. So looking at women and intimate partner gun violence in Louisiana, just a couple statistics from some of the most recent data that we looked at. In 2017, Louisiana had the 2nd highest femicide rate in the United States. More than half of 2017 femicide victims were killed by intimate partners, and 70% of intimate partner femicides were committed using firearms. So there's a similar number there below. There has been at least 1 domestic homicide in every parish in Louisiana. And if you look at how we compare to national, over the course of the data below 2015 to 2019, 106 women were fatally shot by a partner, and nearly 70% of those victims were killed with a gun, compared to nationally 59% of female intimate partner homicide victims were killed with a gun. So we'll talk a little bit about where we stand in terms of legislation in our state. I know this is a wordy slide, but I wanted to make sure I kept kind of all the details, especially if this is going to be shared out. But so over the last several years, I think starting in around 2014, there have been partners across the state have done amazing work when it comes to domestic violence laws. The Southeastern United Way of Southeastern Louisiana, Helena Moreno, JP Morrell, Kim Sport, Charmaine Cassiopeia, and the Family Justice Center have done just amazing work to really try to change the story in Louisiana from everything that we've just seen. So currently, as it pertains to firearms, Louisiana prohibits anyone convicted of domestic violence offenses from possessing a firearm or carrying a concealed weapon for 10 years. Louisiana also prohibits the subjects of permanent injunctions and protective orders from possessing a firearm for the duration of the injunction or the protective order. Upon issuance of a permanent post-separation family violence protective order or an injunction against abuse, the judge is required to order the transfer of all firearms and the suspension of a concealed carry handgun permit of the person who is under the injunction order. So we have very good laws on the books when it comes to, over the last several years, when it comes to making sure that domestic abusers are not legally allowed to have access to firearms. So this is a little bit more into the weeds and the details here too, but when that order is made, the person needs to state in open court the number of firearms in his possession and the location of all of their firearms. They're required to fill out information that states the serial number of each firearm and again the location of each firearm, and transmit a copy of that to the local sheriff's office. And then the sheriff, within 48 hours, they're to transfer all the guns and firearms to the sheriff within 48 hours. And once they've been transferred, this is a piece that's a little bit concerning as well. Once they've been transferred to the sheriff, either the sheriff or the police will keep those firearms, or they may opt to have a third party who does not live with the defendant to actually hold those transferred firearms, which of course is a little concerning. But we do have processes in place to, over the course of the last few years, the groups I mentioned, the advocates continue to refine these laws. Initially there wasn't a mechanism to relinquish the firearms or have the judges and the sheriffs actually proactively take the firearms, but that's been put in place now. So there are laws on the books, again, that are to change the tide when it comes to domestic violence homicide in our state. Talking a little bit about some of the concerns. So, the number one concern is that there is a lack of enforcement of these firearm prohibitions and confiscations. So this was just an example that came out this past week, and this is only speaking to Orleans Parish, but Court Watch NOLA found that although it's required by law, magistrate court judges failed to ask defendants with an active domestic violence stay-away order if they own firearms in at least 40% of the time. So this is definitely one of the biggest concerns, is that while these laws have been put in place, they're on the books, we're not necessarily seeing the enforcement when it comes in courtrooms across the state. And this is just New Orleans, and so you can imagine what the rest of the state looks like. And then we also are reliant on the sheriff's office to make sure that there's a transfer of those firearms. The other concern, and I'll talk a little bit of this when I talk about the legislation, as many of you are probably aware of this, with HB 159 making its way through the legislature this year. The current law requires physical abuse to occur for domestic violence laws to apply, these including the laws on the confiscation of the firearms. And we know that many times abuse begins with threats and coercion, and by the time that physical violence occurs, that it may be too late. And then another concern is that while Louisiana does prohibit domestic abusers from owning and purchasing firearms, they can often easily evade these laws by purchasing guns from unlicensed private sellers in Louisiana. So Louisiana is one of the states where you do not have to have a background check to have a private sale of a firearm. So, and there's estimates that up to 30% of firearms are being purchased without a background check. So if you go to a gun show, or a lot of firearms are actually listed on an online site called Arms List. It's like Craigslist for firearms. And if you list your firearm there, you can just meet someone in the parking lot of a grocery store, sell them a firearm, and it's no requirement on anyone's side to have that background check done. So it's just another area where it's very easy for domestic abusers to keep their firearms or purchase firearms outside of the law. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the legislation that affects these areas and has been going through the legislative session this year. So HB 159, Representative Melinda White, this simplifies and unifies one definition of domestic violence. It adds coercion, control, and punishment, though only if it prevents the victim from reporting the abuse to law enforcement or to escaping the relationship. And so, again, what's important about this is that we have several laws in place, but there are different definitions of what constitutes domestic violence, and currently threats and coercion are not included in that. So for anyone who's watching some of these bills, once this bill started making its way through the legislature, we saw a very big opposition from the NRA and the other local guns rights groups, including Louisiana Shooters Association. I think Home Defense Foundation is another one. And they were bringing up a big opposition to this law because it would potentially expand the number of individuals, domestic abusers, who would not be able to, would have their firearms and their right to a firearm taken away. Of course, we know that we want to stop violence before it happens, and particularly before it turns into a death. So currently, this bill it did make it through committee on in the second committee. There were some concerns about that, but it did make it through. But it's currently pending House Conference Committee. So I believe, right now it's just waiting conference. There were some amendments that were trying to be added, but they would really dilute the bill and keep it from being as effective. So I know this is currently in conference committee right now. A couple other, HB 55, Representative Amy Freeman creates a domestic violence fatality review team within the Louisiana Department of Health, and this was enrolled and signed by the Speaker of the House yesterday. So that's also very important. And again, a lot of the data is missing because we are not, we don't have a good way of reviewing gun violence, gun deaths, particularly because there's been so much opposition to that across the country over the last 2 decades. So I think this is a really great move as well. HB 452 by Representative Paula Davis creates a domestic violence fee. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. That's a typo on my part. I'll get sorry about that. I'll move on, but I'll double check which one I was supposed to put there. I will say that we did have Representative Mandy Landry, who put in an actual proactive gun bill this year. Unfortunately, it's not going to turn into law this year, but it was really great to have something to, from a positive standpoint, because when it comes to firearms in the state, we're always acting very defensively. And because while we see such high levels of gun violence in our state, such high levels of femicide, intimate partner gun violence, we see that our legislature at the same time is currently always trying to roll back the safety regulations that we have in place. I'll talk a little bit more about that with the next slide, but Representative Manny Landry did put forth HB 353, which requires a background check on all gun sales, including private sales. So that would have closed that loophole we talked about, where individuals can purchase guns without a background check through private sales. Unfortunately, the bill was heard in the House Committee on Administrative Criminal Justice and was voluntarily deferred. It was clear in the committee hearing that there were some concerns, some legitimate concerns about the process, but there also was not support for the bill in the committee. And so Representative Landry did voluntarily defer that bill. But how it relates we know that more access to guns will lead to more violence. That's just been proven over and over again. If it was the other way around, we would be the safest country, we would be the safest state, one of the safest states in the entire country, and that's just not true, right? But as a note, in states that require background checks for all handgun sales, 47% fewer women are shot to death by their intimate partners. So we definitely see a correlation between the background checks and domestic violence homicide. So, sorry, the slide's a little sloppy, but did want to talk a little bit about this. SB 118 and HB 596. These are 2 of 3 permitless carry bills that were put in this year, introduced, and basically they remove the current permitting and training process for concealed carry of a firearm. So today in Louisiana, if you want to conceal carry a firearm, you need to go through 9 hours of training. That training includes everything from keeping guns secure away from children, proper storage, and actually firing a firearm. And both of these bills strip away that training and the permitting process. So it would mean that anyone who is legally able to own a firearm can conceal carry that firearm without ever having gone through a permitting process, without ever having to go through potentially even a background check, because if they purchase their firearm through a private sale, they're not required to do a background check, and they won't go through any of the training. I wanted to note that in committee hearings, proponents of the bills were saying that domestic abuse victims need to be able to conceal carry without waiting for a training and permit. And they, made a big point to talk about this. And the truth is that, one, we already know that the presence of a gun makes things more deadly for victims of abuse. And also, Louisiana law already addresses this and allows victims of abuse to obtain a 45-day temporary concealed carry permit while applying for their permanent permit. So I've heard Representative Fano, who put this bill in, talk about, the poor domestic violence woman who, is afraid for her life and has to wait 90 days to get a permit. If she follows the law, she needs to be able to conceal carry immediately. Well, this is already addressed in Louisiana law. And then, so these bills, SB 118 has passed and has been sent to the governor. HB 596, which is essentially the same bill, is currently subject to call in the Senate. It's actually scheduled for tomorrow. I assume that if it gets a vote, it will pass and also go to the governor. So I think, here we go. We do believe that the governor is going to veto any permitless carry. He's been very vocal that he thinks that the permitting process in Louisiana is, the right balance between regulation and liberty and freedom, which are the words that get thrown out a lot about what we call permitless carry. They like to call constitutional carry. But so John Bel Edwards has been very vocal, saying that he does not approve of removing the permitting and training processes when it comes to concealed carry. We do expect that he veto the bill. We do not know what would happen if there is a veto session. I have on the slide here, there are some legislators that voted for the bills to pass the first time, but we believe may not vote to override a veto. So we are trying to reach out to those representatives to ask them to please, oppose any future attempts to push permitless carry. We have seen in other states that have done permitless carry, like Arizona and Alaska, that gun violence has increased in the years afterwards, particularly gun assaults. And we just know that, again, in a state where we have the highest gun violence rate and fourth highest gun death rate, that we should not be stripping away the safety protections that we have in place today. So I will end it there and open up for questions.
Thanks, Red, so much. If folks have questions, they can type them in the chat. If we don't get any questions right away, then we can go ahead and move to the presentation by Star, and then we can circle back with more questions at the end.
Okay.
Well, Red, I have one question. This is Routen Barber with Lift Louisiana. You showed a slide that talked about judges, 40-some% that were not asking for the firearms to be turned in. Are they just forgetting to do this, or they don't really give a damn?
Well, that wasn't in the report, so I can't speak to their actual intention, but I know this has been a concern. Just talking to Kim Sport and some of the other advocates, that there's a concern that while we have been able to pass these bills, that there's still a sentiment that it's not supported completely. I don't know if that speaks to why judges are not doing it. I don't know if it's because the laws are relatively new and they're not like you said, thinking of them, or I mean, it's their job, right? They should be following the law as it's written and doing their job. I do think that's probably one of the next steps for us as a state, as advocates, is to put the pressure to make sure that we understand who is enforcing it and who is not, and then put the pressure and the accountability. I do know that Tulane is actually recently, under the Biden administration, there has been some money that has been available for research around gun violence. And Tulane is doing one of the first studies under that program. And it is related to these laws specifically and how they impact domestic violence homicides. And so, hopefully a component of that is looking at, okay, what actually, are judges and sheriffs actually following the law and doing the things that they're supposed to remove the firearms.
Gotcha. Well, we have another question. Jocelyn wanted to know, can you talk more about what Moms Demand Action does?
Sure. So so gun violence is a very complicated issue. So there's not just one answer to it. We do believe that, there are some things we can do at a federal level in terms of having background checks on all guns sales, that we are proponents of extreme risk protection order laws, which, if someone is in crisis and an immediate danger to themselves or others, that firearm, there's a process that could be put in place for them to be removed from firearms temporarily. So there's laws that we advocate for at a national level, at the state level, and a local level. And that's, a big focus of ours during legislative session. But other than that, we also have programs around teaching safety around guns, particularly for keeping children safe. We have a program called Be Smart, which is all about making the ask, and if your children are going to be in someone else's home, finding out if they have firearms, how they're stored. We table in the community, and we give out free gun locks at community events. We also work with local partners, and so there's a lot of people on the ground who have been doing this work and have been closer to these issues than we have, for a long time. So we work with groups like Faith in Action in Baton Rouge, and there's groups across the state and across the country, of course, that have been, very close to these issues of gun violence. We also have a survivors network, so we have some support peer-to-peer support, counseling support, things like that through the Everytown Survivor network for survivors of gun violence. So a survivor could mean a lot of different things, but anyone who's been directly impacted by violence. And then, you know, of course, we advocate for more violence interruption programs like Cure Violence in New Orleans is one. We have other groups like that across the state and across the country, but, you know, it's a lot of things. We know that there's different, there's just so many different facets of gun violence. And so we try to work with local partners, work at a federal level. And of course, state legislative is our big focus right now. And hopefully we can sigh a breath of relief on that pretty soon once we know what's going to happen with some of these bills. But yeah, and if anyone is interested in, you know, getting involved and finding more out, please, you know, send me a message in the chat or let Michelle know, and we can reach out to you and let you know more about how you can get involved with Moms Demand Action here in Louisiana.
Thank you, Red. Yeah, so we will. Yeah, Red, if you want to share your email in the chat with folks to get in touch with you, that would be great. We did put your @ there, so so folks can follow you on social media. You know, you all are putting out some great content, so I know that that's a really good place for people to kind of keep up with what you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Red.
Okay, great. So we are going to switch over to hear from Star. And then I'm just going to spotlight our host here.
Michelle, can everyone see my screen?
We can see your screen.
Perfect. Welcome, welcome. What a fun and exciting session so far. One more day. Hello. So I am Rachel Aber. I'm a social worker. I am the founder and president of STAR. And along with me is my colleague who has become what's known as a celebrity at the legislature, Morgan Lamondre. And Michelle, thank you for so many of the accolades earlier in the webinar today. I do want to say that Morgan has single-handedly done the majority of the legislation you're seeing over the past 5 or 6 years come out of Louisiana in regards to sexual assault survivors and increasing protections for survivors. So I do want to give her major kudos. And for those of you that aren't familiar with STAR, we are a nonprofit organization. We have 3 locations in the Louisiana area, in Alexandria, Baton Rouge, and New Orleans. We started here in Baton Rouge, at our hometown, actually part of the East Baton Rouge District Attorney's Office, and we became a nonprofit in 2012. So we've grown tremendously over the past 9 years, and legislative advocacy is just one of the areas of work that we do. We're most well known for our survivor services, and those are broken out into 3 programs. We do 24/7 advocacy for survivors. Those are people that have been either immediately or recently sexually assaulted, and they need assistance through our hotline. We also accompany survivors to the hospital for forensic exams, and we do needs assessment and safety planning with any survivor as they navigate the life they're living after a sexual assault, including if they report it to the criminal justice system. We also have counseling services, and that's individual or group counseling for primary survivors as well as secondary survivors, which could be family members, spouses, partners, children of survivors. And then our legal program, of which Morgan is our founding legal director, and it's really her baby. We've become very well known for our legal services, and we're actually the first sexual assault program, and I would go ahead and say the only sexual assault program in Louisiana doing direct client work and representing clients at no charge. In addition to those services, we also do community services. We provide education and training, both to youth and adults, as well as do consulting with businesses. And most recently, we've been known for doing a lot of consulting work for universities here in Louisiana with a lot of media attention around campus sexual assault. Um, as with anything we talk about, we always try to do just a little content advisory. We know that sexual assault is very prevalent in our communities, and we know that people that are listening or people that are present on this webinar have been affected in some way, whether they're a survivor themselves or if they know a survivor. And so we just want to ask everyone to take care, and certainly with the very intense bills we're talking about, we know these affect people. And so if this impacts you, I just want you to keep in mind that there are resources available both locally and nationally. There's an online hotline from RAINN, which is the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, which you can visit at hotline.rainn.org. And STAR's 24-hour hotline is always available at 1-855-435-STAR. And so if you or someone you know, either today or in the future, needs support, please know that we're here and happy to be supportive in whatever way we can. So I'll turn it over to Morgan to talk more specifically about our legislative work this session. And we're going to go over a couple of bills that we've been instrumental in. And I will start with House Bill 12. Morgan, take it away.
So I want to just say a forewarning. I keep getting this nice message that says my internet connection is unstable. So I'm sorry if then I get choppy and cut off. But I also want to say I'm humbled by what Rachel said, but I definitely have not single-handedly done all of our legislation as far as for sexual assault survivors. We've had a lot of support, but she is right. The legal program is my baby. But just to kind of start with House Bill 12, this was a bill that we asked Representative White to bring for us last year, but because of COVID, it was one that kind of got pushed back to this year. And what we did was ask her if we could be part of a list of organizations in Louisiana that it basically makes it easy for people to donate to us when they're doing their state income tax returns. And some of you may not be aware. I'm sure many of you, all of you are probably not surprised, but Louisiana doesn't have specific state general dollars for sexual assault service providers. There are some states in the country that do not have general dollars for sexual assault services, but of course, Louisiana is one of them. We do not typically prioritize general dollars for things that like services for domestic violence, sexual assault, but definitely for sexual assault, we don't even have a dedicated fine for service providers. So we asked Representative White to bring this bill that would allow us to be on the list. And so we will be on the list next year when you're doing your state income tax returns. That allows you to easily donate $5, $10. We do have to really push for people to donate to us, because I'm told that if we do not receive any donations after a certain amount of years or a low amount, they do take us off that list. So we are hopeful that this will be one way for us to sort of easily get some people to donate to our cause, because we do, as Rachel went over, all of our services for survivors are completely free. And so, our services are completely free, but the quality is not something that you think you wouldn't pay for. The service quality is definitely no different than what you would get if you went to a private counselor, advocate, or an attorney. So if we could go to our next bill. And this was the bill, I think, that was a typo on Red's slide. It's something that we were in full support. It was a bill that LCADV definitely took the lead on this bill, and we are so thankful for that. It essentially allows survivors to not need a notary when they're filing for a petition for a protection order. So in some jurisdictions, the law really says that clerks are supposed to make the notary services available to survivors as well as the paperwork, but not all clerks of court in Louisiana were doing so. And for some, they were saying, well, you have to go get this notarized somewhere. Well, when a survivor is forced to pay a private notary to notarize a petition, that runs afoul with the Violence Against Women Act, which basically says survivors are not supposed to pay upfront costs for protection orders. In fact, they're not supposed to pay for them. The only way in Louisiana someone would ever be cast with costs is if a petition was found to be frivolous. But obviously in that situation, you know, the law basically would be finding that the person who filed the petition was not a survivor. But we are very excited about this. There was, of course, some opposition by the NRA. There was concern that this would somehow allow people's guns to be taken away before they had a hearing, which of course is not true, but sometimes the narrative that is presented is not always the truth. So we could go to our next slide. And then we have House Bill 159. This is another one that we have been in full support with our sister organizations on. It's another bill that, you know, it really was something that came out of the Law Institute. A couple of years ago, Representative Melinda White asked the Law Institute to study sort of all the definitions, making it clear and consistent throughout the code, and just sort of a lot of cleanup. The big part of the bill really is, it was on the original bill, it was around page 6, where it really showed the definition. And right now, you know, the way the definition for domestic abuse can be found in certain places is that it wouldn't necessarily have emotional or financial abuse. But then in other places, it's like it includes, but is not limited to physical types of violence. And what this bill did was create a narrow definition that shows that when somebody is being financially abused, emotionally abused, in order to prevent leaving the relationship, and there's, you know, obviously there's some more verbiage there, but in that situation, that could be used alone to get a protection order. And what, you know, there was testimony in committee that essentially allowed, you know, or was evidence to show that some of the most egregious forms of domestic violence, domestic abuse, happens with this isolation control to really prevent survivors from being able to escape. And then when the last straw happens, when the survivor is trying to escape, you know, obviously there may not have been physical abuse, but then that's where we see maybe it being too late. So it is currently in conference committee. Unfortunately, there was an incident at the Capitol. I think the session has been very tense, and there's been a lot of gaslighting, really. I will just say gaslighting by legislators, gaslighting by people opposed to certain bills, saying, you know, we're crazy, this doesn't really happen, and I think that that has caused some tensions to be high, and people are a little on edge by the fact that what seems to be a very simple bill that is just a no-brainer is becoming so incredibly challenging to get past. And you know, I hope that everything will turn out all right, and there will be a everyone will concur in the conference report once it comes out. But so just keep contacting your legislators about that one. It really is something that we need to kind of have all hands on deck right now, as we're really under the wire to finish the session. And then we have House Bill 375, which is sort of the highlight, I will say, to what has been kind of a not so great session overall. House Bill 375 is really another one that I call my baby, because it was something that I've been thinking about since I was an advocate before STAR was STAR. And it was really before I went to law school, and then during law school when I would accompany survivors to forensic exams, and they would essentially have all these issues outside of the criminal justice system. And one of them was typically, I don't want to go back to the place where I was sexually assaulted. And this bill essentially allows survivors to terminate their leases early as a result of sexual assault. And, you know, there's some definitely specific procedures that a survivor has to go through in order to get this type of relief, but it's still something. It's better than what we had before. And it's actually, I think, just one of the highlights to this session. And it was signed as Act 1 by the governor, which usually that Act 1 is reserved for something pretty big and special. And so I am definitely proud of this bill and all of our supporters, especially Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center in New Orleans, as well as even our opposition. Our opposition, we worked with them so hard because this was another bill from last year that it was introduced but never got heard. And we actually worked with the Apartment Association for months now to get this in a posture where they could agree to. And not only did they, usually your goal for when you have people who typically are opposed to a bill, you want them to remain neutral. The Apartment Association supported the bill and put in green cards, and that is really the only reason why I think we got just such unanimous support for a bill that otherwise would have been very controversial. And we had so many co-authors. So, and I think it actually there was maybe even more co-authors than what we had on the slide, but I haven't updated that. House Bill 379 is a bill that allowed for punitive damages for sexual harassment in the workplace. Punitive damages, for those of you who are not attorneys, is really damages that's meant to punish. So, in any kind of lawsuit, you can get damages for lost wages, medical expenses, things to kind of put you back in a position of had the trauma not occurred. Punitive damages is really meant to punish. And so this was a bill that was not something that was against the business. It would be against the perpetrator for punitive damages. We are at sort of a roadblock, or were in the Senate Judiciary A. The bill was about to be killed. And I sort of pleaded that we can come up with some language to narrow the definition, because I was told that by one senator, I don't want locker room talk to be something somebody can be held liable for punitive damages. I was trying to get them to specify what locker room talk was. He didn't. And then I was told by another senator that as a mom of 2 sons, she has to balance the interest of being a woman, but then also balancing the interest of her sons. And so I think we posted that video somewhere. I kind of said, as a mom of 2 sons as well, I want us to teach our children that, there's no place that certain language and certain things should be discussed, and we need to hold people accountable. So I got, as the word that is usually said in the Capitol, sassy. I got sassy for that one. And that was not the first time in this particular committee. This is the same committee that, took issue and the chairman was cutting off survivors. And I got sassy again and went to the table and said respectfully, like way too many times, but I think I said respectfully every time I wanted to say a cuss word. So, and just basically said I would like for them to stop cutting survivors off. So yeah, that's what the session has been like. And then Senate Bill 211 is another one that we were in support of. STAR, as part of our education services, provides ACEs training, and so adverse childhood experiences, and that this bill basically mandated in-service trainings for teachers. And I think all too often teachers, sometimes not knowing, may just think somebody's acting out in classrooms out of, this is a bad child or something, without understanding that typically children react and do certain things all for a reason. And by going through this training, they may be able to easily identify some of the things that are happening and I think help and intervene earlier on. But this is the training that we actually really want legislators to take. So we are going to be offering a training for the legislators soon for ACEs. We're hoping they all take it. So maybe they would be a little bit more trauma informed overall at the Capitol too. And Senate Bill 230 is one of the campus sexual assault bills. There's sort of a companion one. It's pretty much identical at this point, that Representative Amy Freeman also passed. And it essentially is clarifying some loopholes in our College Safety Act to address some of the things you may have seen in the news from the USA Today articles dealing with LSU and campus sexual assault survivors. So we're trying to close some of those loopholes, make sure people understand the reporting requirements, and really clarifying language that's used. You know, we're obviously trying to clean up the language for sexual abuse in House Bill 159. Well, this particular bill is clarifying some other language. In 232, Senate Bill 232 by Senator Barrow is a panel to review power-based violence protocols, procedures on college campuses. And it'll be sort of a way to have some level of oversight for campus sexual assaults. I do believe that, you know, without that, we would just be in a place again where we're going to the Capitol, hoping for intervention and having committee hearings like what happened this year. But hopefully this bill will help a panel really talk about issues, you know, just constant oversight, constant having the issue of campus sexual assault be discussed. So nothing goes through the cracks. And yeah. And I don't know if Rachel.
Yeah, so thank you, Morgan. And you know, we just picked out a couple of bills that have been on our radar, and hopefully some that are better news than most of the other bills going through session that deal with women and transgender people. But before we kind of close out, I wanted to open it up to any questions about any of the bills or any clarification needed.
Yeah, Rachel and Morgan, great presentation. Again, this is Rob and Barbara. And we do have several questions. The first one I want to ask is there any legislation coming up or coming down the pipes that deals directly with colleges and universities underreporting about sexual assaults on their campus so they don't draw attention to themselves because they're not doing anything about it?
Yeah, so the bills, Senator Meisel's bill, as well as Representative Freeman's bill, whichever one, you know, gets signed by the governor, those do close in those loopholes. Representative Reiser's bill, he has one too, but I think his bill got incorporated into Meisel and Freeman's to address reporting requirements. You know, the other thing too that tends to be confusing is that federal law typically has some mandates on colleges and universities that say you have to report crimes through the Clery Act that happen on your campus. The issue though is that in codes of conduct, not all sexual assaults that happen or get reported to the university need to be reported in the Clery stats because it doesn't actually occur on campus. So what the bills do is actually talk about reports dealing with sexual assault under the codes of conduct, and that will require an annual, I think it's annual. I need to double check. We've changed the legislation through the process, but it will require certain reports. We've also had conversations separately about the possibility of our legislative auditor auditing each of the public universities too, to kind of make sure what they're reporting matches what they have information about. So hopefully that answers your question.
Gotcha.
I do also want to add.
Thank you. Michelle has a question about I'm sorry.
That's okay, Robin. I just kind of wanted to briefly mention, this doesn't have anything to do with our session currently, but there has been, the Department of Education on the federal level has opened up public comment for Title IX. It's actually this week, dealing with campus sexual assault. Title IX is the primary vehicle for which we can hold universities accountable for sexual misconduct violations Many of you might know that under Betsy DeVos, there were a lot of controversial changes that many view as not very survivor or trauma informed focused, and not very
Right.
student focused.
Right.
And so I just wanted to throw out there that they are opening it up for public comment, and that hopefully we will see changes on the federal level as well as our state level when it comes to campus sexual assault.
Gotcha. Okay, well, Michelle has a question. Michelle, you want to ask it, or you just want me to read it about the tax donation bill?
Oh, yeah, it's a specific question, but before we get to that, since Rachel, you just mentioned the public comment period, if STAR has some talking points that you can share for other advocacy organizations that could help inform our comments, I mean, we'd love to send those out to, to
Absolutely.
folks on our network, and use them to help draft some of our own comments. But yeah, so I was super excited to see the tax donation for STAR. I think it's amazing. Every year when I fill out my taxes, I'm always like kind of confused by the organizations that they're asking whether or not I want to donate to. And then also, Lift Louisiana has been kind of doing a lot of digging into other organizations, I would say unworthy organizations that are getting money from either taxpayers through things like license plates or other state and federal programs, where there's no accountability. And for those folks that don't know this about Lift Louisiana, we are definitely a reproductive rights organization, but we're also a good governance and public accountability organization. And so I guess I wanted to ask you a little bit about, how you all have thought about transparency in terms of, accepting donations from the public in that way. And, what you're, currently what you're doing to make the work of the organization transparent so that people really know where their donations are going.
Sure.
Yeah. Rachel, do you want to go first?
I can. Well, just
Okay.
to speak generally, STAR, because we receive over 60% of our budget is from federal funds, we must complete a single audit each year, which is the highest threshold of an audit any entity receiving public funds must go through. Those are all posted on our website at star.ngo/about us. So we make our 990s and single audits each year public. And those are broken down into looking at each revenue source, and then also looking at our expenses, and where all those funds are going. And actually, we operate as a very lean organization. In fact, our direct service versus management and fundraising expenses, it's about 93% direct service to 7% admin. Which I don't eat. It's not a brag at all. It's just to say there's so limited funds for this type of work, specifically legislative advocacy, as well as, supporting operations. So we try to make those things public, and certainly don't have anything to hide, although I'll let Morgan speak more about that.
Yeah, and I will say just sort of a couple of different points that STAR stands out in general about organizations, but before I do that, I want to talk specifically about tax donations. So as part, I drafted this bill, but as part of that draft, I asked Rachel, I'm like, I don't want to make this too difficult for us because we don't have a lot of admin support. So basically, by drafting what I did draft, it would probably fall on Rachel, but we put in there that essentially, data and documents about how that money, which is still a donation, and donation should typically be unrestricted, but we basically imposed on ourselves in that bill the allowing the state to demand reports from us for these donations and information about that. That's something that typically happens, I guess, when you get on that list. But from what I understand, they don't really report on it. Like they don't really pay attention to that. And I will say, one of the things that, going back to the point about STAR, is that, as a social justice organization, we have constantly been doing internal audits of, making sure that we on our staff, like, pay equity within our staff and different issues, and being, mostly a staff of all, women identified persons, just making sure, I guess, there's transparency about that. We don't say, you can't talk about your salary. I mean, there are people obviously that don't want to do that, but that, when reviewing other people's policies, we always see that, even though that's a violation of law. So we've been doing different things to really do internal work for STAR on equity and transparency. And it's funny because I constantly, when I'm talking to legislators, I'm like, I will put STAR against any organization because we are very upfront, and it's almost obnoxious at times because we have to do a lot of work in order to get reimbursed for certain things. But at the same time, it ends up being like I donate to STAR. And before I worked at STAR, even though most of my work is in nonprofits, I didn't donate to places I worked. I donate to STAR because I'm so confident in how we spend our money and know exactly where it's going. So it's definitely, as far as that goes, I would say our policies, our procedures, all of our audits are posted, our 990s. Yeah. So hopefully that answers your question. I never know if I'm answering people's questions or not.
No, that's really good. That's really good. Really, that was kind of like,
Michelle
I wanted to tee you
has
all
a
up.
couple more questions.
Yeah, I wanted to tee you all up for an opportunity to, tout how transparent you are about your funding. So, yeah. Yeah, so I guess, yeah, I could ask the next question that I have, which is, and this is both for STAR and for Red. So I'm gonna pin everybody in the same thing. So bear with me for a sec. Okay, everyone's here. Okay. Yeah, so this is for both organizations. So how important has it been for you to work in coalition with other organizations to get support for, not only the bills that you've talked about for this session, but all the great work that both organizations have done in the past?
I can start speaking to that. Yeah, I would say through the legislative session, it's incredibly important. I think we're a national organization, even though we are grassroots, and I'm a volunteer, or up to this, everyone in the state who works with Moms Demand Action is a volunteer. And but we have sort of a reputation nationally too, and I would say it's an unfair reputation that we're anti-gun when we're really, pro-gun safety, pro-saving lives. But also just because, these bills are always so interconnected, and there's so many groups that are doing all this great work that I just think, particularly through the legislative session, we have found that just strengthening those coalitions, those partnerships, and being there to support the other organizations across the state, it becomes more and more important every year. It seems like this year, I think maybe it was Morgan who said it's been kind of a rough session for a lot of the people who advocate, for these bills to improve the lives of women and families and everyone in the state. So I think just being able to lean on a lot of different organizations and get support from different groups either for bills or to help in defense. I think a lot of what we do from a Moms Demand Action standpoint is defense. And so then hopefully we're also there to turn around and support the organizations that are doing these bills that overlap with our work, but may not be necessarily solely focused on firearm safety regulations. And then that extends, of course, to the work that we do throughout the year. And I do think that, to be frank, a lot of our volunteers look a lot like me, and I'm not really the person who's most impacted by gun violence in this country or the state or this city. And so, we've tried to figure out, where do we fit in and how do we support the local partners and organizations and people and survivors who are in communities, the Black and Brown communities who are impacted by this issue on a daily basis, and try to figure out how do we how do we support and show up for organizations who are doing that work. So that's always something that we're trying to do a better job at, while figuring out where we maybe bring in resources from a legislative standpoint, from a from our national recognition standpoint, but without coming in and trying to solve a problem that we're not, when there are people here who have been working on this issue forever, who are most impacted by the issue. So that's something that we're always talking about and trying to figure out how to get better at.
Great, thank you. Well, we want to be respectful of everyone's time, and so it's 7:12 now, but we have a couple of more questions. And one is, Morgan, we need more women like you in the legislature. When are you running again, young lady?
I am going to be paying very close attention to the redistricting process. And I think, I am the type of person who wants to run where I feel I am qualified to be. And of course, I hope everyone on this call considers running. And, I would imagine if you're here on this call, you probably lean a certain way ideologically. Get involved with organizations like Emerge, where you can do a training program. But I think that, for the type of policy that I'm definitely feel most qualified for, I am interested in the legislature, and I see a need for people like us who are willing to do the work, to say the things that, may not be popular, or may not get us donations, but will actually fulfill our core values and personal missions, and also make Louisiana better for the citizens of the state. And so, yeah, thank you for that question. We'll see what happens. I do.
Well, you definitely have the skills. You have the sass and you know the law. So yeah, makes you a qualified candidate, my dear.
That's what I've realized being at the legislature. You get the sassy reputation when you call people out on their BS. Okay. And they say that this is, unintended consequences and this is that. It's like, actually, so I could be the actually person, actually, that's not what the law says, and that's not how it is. And it's also interesting to see the hypocrisy. But yeah, so I hope everyone on this call runs for office too.
Okay. Well, does anyone else have a question of our gracious panel this evening? This was excellent information.
Yeah, thanks for having us. It was a great session.
We really appreciate.
Yeah, very good.
Not the actual session, but this
well,
one.
I'm going to turn it back over to Michelle.
Thank you, Robin. And yes,
I'm going to turn it back over to Michelle.
Yeah, this was great. And thank you, Robin. And I want to thank all of you. I mean, I could sit here and talk to you ladies like all night about this, but the session is not quite over, and we have a lot of bills that are, still in place. So we all have work to do still. So I really, really, really appreciate you all taking out some of this precious time to be with us this evening, to answer our questions, to talk about the amazing work that you're doing, and to let us all know how we can support you know, these issues and the legislation that you're working on. As I mentioned earlier, we have recorded this. We will post it on YouTube. We'll share the link with you. We'll share all of the great information and resources that you've shared with us, with all of our followers. And we'll be back again next year.